Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 100. Yay! And my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. When I started this podcast a little over 2 years ago, I had no idea what was going to happen. I didn't know if anybody would listen. I worried that I would run out of things to talk about. But here we are, and I have every expectation of doing a 200th episode because I am having a great deal of fun. I am recording this episode in October. I'm not sure when it's going to air because I will be doing some traveling at the end of October. I will tell you that October's been a bit of a topsy-turvy month. I've had a lot going on that has taken me away from my sewing machine. This morning, I was drying my hair with my hair dryer when all of a sudden there was a very loud pop and sparks from the outlet and the lights went out. So I went and got my husband and we determined that I had popped the breaker. And he said, "How old is this hair dryer?" And I said, "Well, I've had it since the girls were in elementary school, and the girls are 33 and 28 now." So he told me to go buy a new hair dryer. But that's what kind of day it's been today. As promised, this is going to be a listener question episode, and I want to thank all of you who sent me questions. You sent some really good ones, and I appreciate it so much. I'm going to answer at least one question from each person. I may do more than one question depending on how long the answers are, but I will answer at least one question from each person. And if for some reason I missed your question, go ahead and resubmit it because I'm sure I'll be doing this again. So from Mary Karen in Royal Oak, Michigan, I got a question about what I do with all my muslins. This is a great question. They're all great questions, but this is a great question. If my muslin is wearable, but it doesn't fit me the way I want it to, I will still finish it. And if it's in a decent fabric, like if it were a wearable muslin, if it were something that I would be willing to wear out in public, so not a sheet, I will finish the garment and donate it to a local thrift store. I don't donate junk. I donate things that I would be willing to wear. Sometimes I keep my muslins as class samples. I did that for the free range slacks. I've got a couple of pairs that I don't wear, but I use them as class samples and I take them with me so that people can try them on, and that helps us to narrow down what size to make. Sometimes I will keep a muslin because it's got a technique on it or it taught me something that I need to remember or reference back to. So I will keep it in storage. The muslins that are made out of sheets, I tend to, if I can repurpose them into a different garment, I'll do that. Otherwise, they usually get ripped up and tossed in the rag bag. Mary Karen also asked, who do I sew for besides myself? My mother, I made her a bathrobe, and my husband, who might get some homemade underwear if I can get my act together here. I have plenty of clothing. I don't really need any more clothing. I'm trying to be very careful about not buying any more fabric and only shopping for my stash. But I still like to sew and I still like to teach myself new techniques. So one of the things I've been doing is making samples for the store. I teach at a local quilt store called the Quilt Gallery. And I know from personal experience that when I'm shopping in a quilt store, being able to look at and pick up and hold a sample of something often is the thing that makes me decide that I want either that pattern or the fabric. So as much as I can, I try to make samples for the store. Sometimes I buy the fabric if it's a fabric that I know, I'm going to make something that I'll want to wear and use. Sometimes the store gives me the fabric. I do get a discount because I'm a teacher. And we usually work it out. It hasn't been a problem so far. I get the joy of sewing and learning new techniques, and the store gets a sample to put on display and hopefully sell patterns and fabric. I do sometimes sew for other people who are not related to me. My friend Susan lives up the street, and she's been my best friend since we moved to Montana. She has 2 little grandsons who are 6 and 4, and they have learned that if they want something, they can ask Auntie Janet to make it for them. And the older one even has gone so far as to draw me pictures of what he wants and explain to me exactly how he wants what I make him to look. So that's both good and bad. I did try for a couple of years to make things to sell at our craft co-op sale, and I am just not a production sewer. I can't make 40 zipper pouches. Not that I would need to make that many, but I can't make more than maybe 2 or 3 of an item unless they're slightly different. So I still help out and I still support the craft co-op, but that is not where I'm putting my energies these days. From Chris in Oregon, I got a question about what is a woven rayon. So I talk a lot about making a woven t-shirt pattern, and it's a pattern that started out as a commercial pattern, and I adjusted it and tweaked it and messed around with it until I came up with a darted bodice pattern that fits me very, very well. And I make a lot of warm weather woven tops using that pattern. One of the fabrics that I like to use for that pattern is a woven rayon, and I'm differentiating here between a rayon fabric that is woven and a rayon fabric that is knit, because rayon is the fiber and woven or knit is the structure. Rayon is actually a fiber made from wood pulp, and it is extruded through something that looks very similar to a shower head, and it creates long threads, and those are plied together and woven into fabric, or in the case of a rayon knitted into fabric. Rayon has come a long way. I had a rayon button-down top in the 1980s when I was in college, and I wore it a few times and then I washed it and it shrank. And it never unshrunk, and so I couldn't wear it again, and I was pretty upset about it because I really liked the shirt. Rayons now, when you wash them, they do shrink, but when they are dry, they will stretch out again, much more like cotton than they used to be. Because they are essentially a plant fiber, rayon fabrics are very comfortable to wear in warm weather. They are light and breathable. I haven't had as much success with rayon spandex knits because they tend to start looking a little worn after a few washings. It depends a lot on the quality of the fabric. Some rayon spandex fabrics will last longer than others. But these days, if I'm going to buy rayon anything, it's probably going to be a rayon woven. And in terms of the weave, it can be either a plain weave, which is just over, under. It's the one we're most familiar with. It could be a rayon twill. And a twill fabric is what your jeans are woven in. And it's a particular fabric that creates kind of diagonal ridges. It's very durable, which is why it's used for jeans. There are rayon challis fabrics, which are light and drapable. Again, depending on the quality of the fabric, rayon wovens can be difficult to work with. They might fray a lot. So I am almost always finishing the edges on my serger. The other drawback is that they do require ironing. And I know, Chris, you said that you don't particularly like to iron. So rayon fabrics might not be the best choice for you. But I encourage you to try them because you might find that you like them, and it might be worth the little bit of time that you spend pressing them after they come out of the wash. Carrie wants to know if I have any tips on preventing and dealing with sewing burnout, because it's easy to get excited by new projects, but by the time the mock-up is done, the enthusiasm has taken a hike. And Carrie swings between sewing when it's all consuming and then not doing any sewing for months. So how to strike a balance? First of all, I would say don't beat yourself up about it. I think we all go through phases like this. But if you'd rather not have those highs and lows, I would suggest a couple of tips. The first is to try and make sewing a daily practice, even if it's 10 minutes. This doesn't work so well, I will admit, if you're one of those people who has to get out the sewing supplies to sew and then put them away again when you're done. But if you have a dedicated sewing area and can leave your in-process projects, then just try to get in the habit of sewing a little bit every day. And maybe this isn't a good analogy, but I kind of think of it as like brushing your teeth. If you brush your teeth every day, it kind of takes the excitement out of it, right? Don't we all get excited about brushing our teeth? Oh, wait, that's my daughter and her husband, the dentist. But seriously, we don't want it to become a chore, but we want it to become a habit. Because I think that when it's not a habit, it becomes something that we really, really, really look forward to doing. And then maybe we go overboard. I will be the first person to tell you that when I get into the groove, the last thing I want to do is stop sewing and go make dinner. So I think maybe ratcheting down the dopamine hit we get from sewing to where it becomes something that we do every day might help. The second suggestion I have is that when you start a project, realize that this is a longer-term commitment. Instant gratification is kind of a two-edged sword. When I went from being a knitting designer to sewing, I thought, oh my gosh, I can make a top in one afternoon. I should be able to make every piece of clothing in one afternoon. And that's just not realistic. Simple things, yes, you can knock them out in an afternoon. More complex pieces might take a couple of days. They might even take a couple of weeks. So I think being realistic about the amount of time that a project is going to take can be a big help. And also look at your mock-up as research. You are researching the best ways to put that garment together so that when you do your final version, it will be as good as it can possibly be. The mock-up isn't a speed bump on the way to getting to your final version. It is part of the process, and it's a very important part of the process. And maybe you do have to put it in timeout. I spent 2 weeks making muslins out of old sheets for a dress pattern that I was trying to figure out why it didn't fit properly. And when I finally figured out how to make it fit properly, it was the end of August, and the last thing I wanted to do was make a summer dress. So that project's in timeout, and I'll get back to it. I may not get back to it until next summer, but I'll get back to it. It was research, and it was research that helped me because I got a very crucial piece of information that I can use going forward. So, Carrie, I don't know if that helps. I hope it does. But I'd definitely be curious to hear how other listeners have tackled that problem because I think we all deal with it. Mary Karen sent me another batch of great questions, one of which was that she found overlock sewing machine needles in her stash. Can she use them in a regular sewing machine? That is a fabulous question. I hear people ask all the time, can I use sewing machine needles in overlockers or in sergers, but nobody ever thinks to ask, can I do it the other way around? So home sewing machine needles are a needle system known as 130/705 or sometimes 130/705H. The thing about sewing machine needles is that there's some standardization now, but for the first 150 years that sewing machines existed, there was very little standardization of needles. And so different manufacturers would use different needle systems, different types of machines would use different needle systems. It's kind of mind-boggling when you look at all of the different needle systems, but common home sewing needles now are 130/705H. Most sergers, but not all, most sergers, and especially modern ones, use the same needles that sewing machines do. And I think that was a stroke of genius on the serger manufacturer's part, because it is too hard to keep track of multiple needle systems, and it would be too easy to put the wrong needle into a machine. However, some sergers do use a specialized needle system, and they're usually the sergers that have cover stitch capabilities. Those machines use a system called ELX 705. You cannot use an ELX 705 serger needle in a sewing machine. It might be too long. It might hit the hook. It might hit the bobbin case. There are lots of things that can go wrong when you use the wrong kind of needle in your machine. So look very carefully at the package. And just to be safe, I probably wouldn't use a serger needle or an overlock needle in my sewing machine, simply because it would be too easy if I put the wrong needle in to get the machine out of time, and that requires a trip to a service tech. Karen in Wisconsin, I think it's kind of funny that almost everybody that submitted questions has a name that begins with K. But Karen asked if I would share information on my stash. Sure, I love to talk about fabric. So one of the pieces of advice that I got when I started quilting was that if you tend to gravitate toward the same fabric, you will eventually end up with a stash that is fairly cohesive. So if, let's say, Civil War type fabrics are your jam, if you buy Civil War fabrics, then those are the kind of things that you're going to have in your stash, and everything will go together. I have talked about this before. I have winter coloring. I've got black hair and light blue eyes, and I look really good in saturated bright jewel tones. Hot pink, emerald green, sapphire blue. I tend to gravitate toward those colors. Those are the kinds of things that I like to quilt with. Those are the kinds of fabrics that I like to make garments out of. Unfortunately, I'm in a minority. If you go to any store or any fabric store, what you are going to see is muddy earth tones. I am not bitter about this at all, can you tell? But decades of trying to find clothing that looks good on me, that isn't burgundy or gray or brown or navy blue. And I tend to have the same problem with apparel fabrics. So when I find bright colors, I tend to buy them and stick them in my stash. My quilting cotton stash was acquired a couple of different ways. One of the quilt stores here in town sells a lot of fat quarters, and so I would go there on Fridays because all of their fat quarters would be on sale, and I would buy fat quarters and put them in my stash. The other way I got quilt cottons was to clean off the remnant rack at Joann Fabrics. So that's how I got all of my Kona cottons. I got a lot of remnant pieces for quilting, and I make a lot of charity quilts that I donate so they don't have to be made from fabric that's $14 a yard. Some fabrics I inherited from my mother and my mother-in-law. A few I have picked up at estate sales and thrift stores, but I tend not to purchase a lot of fabrics in those locations. just because a lot of times it's hard for me to tell what the fiber content is without burning a little piece of the fabric, and store owners tend to frown on that. In terms of apparel fabric, I have a lot of sweater knits. I love sweater knits. I think that that's a holdover of me being a knitting designer. I like sweaters. I just don't like to take 6 weeks to knit one when I can whip one up on my serger in an afternoon. I've got a lot of pontes. I like ponte. I have a lot of performance fabrics. And I did really beef up the apparel fabric collection in terms of woven fabrics this summer, because I finally came up with a woven tee pattern that fits me really well, and I was making quite a few woven tee tops to wear. So I hope that gives you a better idea of what kinds of fabrics I have in my stash. I'm a little embarrassed by how much fabric I have, but as my husband says, I'm not out gambling at the casino, and I use my fabric to make things that I donate to help people. So on balance, I don't think that my large stash is a bad thing, or at least that's what I tell myself, but it's probably a good thing that Joann Fabrics has gone out of business. Kim asked, another K name, Kim asked, do I pre-wash my fabric? Yes. I pre-wash my fabrics for 2 reasons. The first is that if any shrinkage is going to happen, I want it to happen before I make the garment, not after. The second reason is that I find that it really irritates my hands to work with fabric that hasn't been washed. I noticed when we did that K-facet class, we were using fabric that was coming straight off the bolt. And by the end of that class, my hands were very irritated. I don't know whether it's the sizing in the fabric or something else, but it really does irritate my hands. So I always try to wash the fabric before I use it. And typically, if it's something that can be dried in the dryer, I'll also throw it in the dryer just to maximize the amount of shrinkage that might happen. These next 2 questions really made me think. So Maureen asked, do I plan my projects out, or do I just do things on the spur of the moment? And my answer to that is yes. I do have a loose plan in my head of what I want to sew, but if something comes along that I find intriguing, either because it's a technique that I want to learn or because it's a new fabric that's just come out that I really want to sew with, so I will throw those wild card projects into the mix. But I do try to have some kind of plan of what I'm going to be doing, because otherwise I would get completely scattered and I would probably start 15 or 16 different things with no idea of when I was going to finish them. I work really well with deadlines, so either it's a deadline imposed on me by others or it's a deadline that I impose on myself. But I truly am a technique junkie, so I tend to get seduced by projects that promise to teach me something new and fun. I made a list at the beginning of July of what I wanted to accomplish sewing-wise in July, and it was interesting because I ran across that list again at the beginning of August, and I had accomplished everything that I wanted to get done on that list for July. So making lists and having a plan does keep me accountable. But I also want the freedom to go to the quilt store and see something new and decide that I want to make something out of it. And this last question comes from Sandy, and Sandy wants to know, what sewing plans do I have for 2026? Wow, I hadn't thought about this until she asked. And it kind of goes hand in hand with the previous question. I've got a couple of non-negotiables on the list. My husband asked me if I would make insulated window coverings for our rental house next door. I made those for our house, for our primary residence about 10 years ago, and they really do help to keep the heat in. In fact, I'm going to put them up this afternoon because it's cold enough here now that we need them. I use the warm window shade material from the Warm Company, and I covered them with various kinds of fabrics to match the different rooms. So up in my sewing room, I have shades that are covered in K-facet wide back fabric. But downstairs in the living room, I have something a little bit more sedate. So I need to get over to the rental house pretty soon and take measurements and order some window shade material and make some insulated shades for that house. And hopefully I get them done before 2026 so that they aren't on my 2026 list. I still want to make underwear. I still want to make some boxer shorts for my husband, and I want to make some underwear for myself. Probably not a bra, but definitely some panties. I also very much want to make a dress, and I would like to make a dress that's a little bit on the formal side because I think my younger daughter's going to be getting married in the next year or two, and I want to be able to make my dress. I have a few ideas. The Upton dress by Cashmerette is probably at the top of the list, but I need somebody to help me fit that pattern. So I would like to go over and take a private class with Ryla Bode at the Sewing and Design School in Tacoma and have her help me fit a dress properly. I also want to make a lined coat or a lined jacket, and I also have a raincoat pattern that I've had for probably going on 3 years now, and I really would like to make that raincoat. So my sewing goals for 2026 are kind of big ones. Probably other little projects will get filled in around them, but those are definitely the ones that I want to work toward. And I would also like to get more proficient with my embroidery machine. And mostly that's just going to be sitting down and using it. Again, thank you to everybody who submitted questions. I really think this was a lot of fun, and I would like to do it again in the future. So keep the questions coming. I'll keep them in a file folder, and we'll just use them the next time I get enough to do an entire episode. I appreciate all of my listeners so much. Thank you all for tuning in every week. It's much easier to talk into a microphone when I know that people are listening on the other end, and episode 200 may be here before we know it. As always, feedback is welcome. You can leave a comment on the show notes page. You can use the fan mail feature. You can email me at janet@janetzabo.com. My website is www.janetzabo.com. That has links to the podcast website, to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website, and to my blog, where I post pictures and commentary about what I've been working on. So if you want to see photos of my projects, that's the place to go. Sometimes they also end up on Instagram, but if you want to see them in real time, check out the blog. So until the next episode, I hope you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.